Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. I'm Bernadette, and I'm here with Michael. Rochelle is away this week, so it's the two of us, and we are going to talk about what Rochelle and I were talking about last week, is more about identity and about who am I and what makes up our identity. And I'll explain a little for those that weren't here last week. Can we change our identity, and what goes into that? And so we're going to, talk about a few specifics today, and then Michael is going to share his story of how his identity formed, and also how ancestral healing and the journey that he has been on has influenced his identity as well. So we want to start with some facts. And the first one is that family has a profound influence on our identity. And our early understandings of who we are come from them. So family systems research says we inherit more than just genes. We also inherit our family roles, like the peacemaker, the troublemaker, the caretaker. We learn our values and our beliefs from our families, and we also have our traditions and cultures around our families. So that's kind of where we start. And we also learn the unspoken rules that we live by, and those are things that decisions that we make every day because we just know this is what we're supposed to do. And we don't even know necessarily where that came from, but they stay with us even sometimes when we leave the family system. And then also, where they're coming from, sometimes they're family myths or they're secrets, but they dramatically shape who we are until we begin to realize that we don't have to hold on to them anymore. And people often unconsciously organize their identities around patterns. And so the process of ancestral healing is not just examining identities and behaviors of your ancestors, but also of yourself. And so today, Michael, I would love it if you would begin to share with us a little bit about your family background, where you grew up, and what your first sense of what an identity is.
So the family that I grew up was a very small and splintered family. And of course, as a child, we don't make these kinds of assessments. We just grow up wherever we are. So it was my parents, myself and my brother, and I had two step-grandmothers. And actually, I was just thinking this yesterday. I have no idea at what point I learned that they weren't grandmothers, they were step-grandmothers, and what the implications of that were. So it was a very small family. And the other thing that was very noticeable, or became noticeable later on, was that there were no stories, there were no photographs, there was no memorabilia, there were no origin stories for the family. I didn't know where my mother came from. I only found that out later in life. At some point I learned that my father was born in Wales, but he never exhibited any Welshness. He was never going on about the Welsh boys choir or the rugby or the usual things that Welsh people can be very very loud and proud about their culture. And these are all signs of identity that's been buried, because Bernadette just went through a list of some of the places that we get identity from. So for instance, cultural and backgrounds. So in my family there weren't any. So my mother basically came from nowhere, and my father came from Wales, but there was no Welshness, so he came from nowhere either. And so there weren't really any traditions to build on. And we moved around as children. I was born in the Channel Islands, between England and France. And then we moved to Switzerland, and then France, and then New Zealand. And all of these times we're picking up new identities, we're adding new layers of identity, we're reinventing identity. And we really don't know where any of this comes from. But what I didn't understand for much later was that the absence of identity was undermining me. And this comes to one of the things that I feel is a very, very important point, which is the issue of sensitivity. And our sensitivity deeply affects our identity. If we're less sensitive, we just pick up with whatever is in our environment, we take it on board, we adapt ourselves around it, and off we go. And many people do this for their whole lives, and it's only those of us who are more sensitive start to feel that there's something missing. And in that place of missing identity, we gradually become aware that there's a hole, and we don't know what the hole is, and there's no language around the hole. And this is where the ancestral healing work comes in that we use the family record as a map to go back and create a language around what has happened or not happened.
Michael, I have a question around that. Did you adopt an identity? Did you have an identity that you kind of used in these young years, and as you were growing up, that your family, a role your family assigned to you, or something along those lines?
The main sense, I remember very clearly as a child feeling that I was abandoned, despite the presence of my parents. Both my parents were there, and I could see they were trying to do the best for me, and yet I still had this feeling of having been abandoned. And it was difficult to create a clear identity from that place. So I didn't really have a sense of identity. I was just reacting to these situations. And then I left school and went into the workplace, and I turned out to be very good at whatever I turned my hand to in the workplace. And this was in New Zealand in the 1970s. It was most people didn't go to college, university then. There were very, only if you were doing one of the professions. Otherwise, most people, you went out and you learned on the job. And I worked in a bank, and then eventually I ended up designing IT systems at what's now the Heinz factory in New Zealand. It's the largest canning factory in the Southern Hemisphere. And we just learned on the job. And my great gift, which is the gift that I brought into this ancestral healing work, is pattern recognition. And so whenever I was in the workplace, I was able to use my pattern recognition, and so complicated factory processes, I used to look at them and go, oh yeah, that's how this works. And so that worked very well. So I had this very, there was a big gap between my external presentation, where I was actually doing very well, and I ended up making a lot of money as an IT consultant in America. And yet in my internal landscape, there was no real sense of identity whatsoever.
So Michael, what I'm hearing is that this adapting, that you were able to, I kind of want to use the word chameleon, where in each situation that you chose whatever it was that you needed to be in that moment. I think that's very, very common for people, and it's part of this whole identity that why we're talking about it is because we have these different roles that we play. Is there any, was there any time, or when was there a time that you began to realize that this was going on, that that's what you were kind of realizing, that okay, I'm my safety mechanism is I know who I'm supposed to be in each moment.
Yeah, as a teenager, I was aware as a teenager in my later teenage years that something wasn't right, and that I was somehow living at some distance from life. And this is a thing called depersonalization, where it was literally like my energy, my soul, call it what you want, was kind of withdrawing from the physical world because it was too painful to go there. And I was aware that was happening, but I had no ability to articulate it or to do anything about it for a long time. And so for a long time, I just went out and did stuff. And as I say, I was successful in the business world while being aware of being completely lost in my inner world. And it wasn't until the early 1990s that the separation between those two, between the inner me and the outer me, reached a critical point. And this happened as a result of the first time that I went from New Zealand up to work in America. I'd been involved in New Zealand implementing software for an American software company, and I had the opportunity to go and work directly for them for a 3-month period, which I accepted. And I had a girlfriend at the time, and what we didn't know at the time was that she'd just become pregnant, and I went away, and during that time she actually had a miscarriage and lost the child. And of course I wasn't there, and this was back when phone calls cost, I can't remember how many dollars a minute it was, and email didn't exist, and all of these things. So I didn't even know anything about it until I came back. Turned up a couple of months later, and basically the abandonment that I'd experienced had played out, and I'd abandoned her at that time when she needed me, and it broke the relationship. And I can remember a few months later, I was just lying on the floor of the house that we'd built together, or partly built together, and I can remember I just swore to myself that I was going to change. And I can remember saying, I don't care how long this takes, I don't care what it costs, and I don't care how much it hurts, but I am going to change. And I can still, to this day, remember the intensity of that promise.
Michael, thank you for sharing that. And there is an intensity when this shift happens, and we suddenly have this desire to look at who we are and to know more about. And I think it's what draws people here to be listening to us as we're speaking. Could you share when this turned into where the ancestry maybe had came in? Was it quite a bit different from that time? Like what was either the in-between time, or what was the catalyst?
The first experience I had, and again, I knew nothing about, I didn't even know the word trauma at this point. I didn't know anything about generational trauma. I didn't know anything about ancestral healing. The thing that happened next was that I met somebody who became, in spiritual terms, you would call them a threshold guardian. I met a lady who was well into the New Age spiritual healing space, and she led me into that space at that time in the late 1990s. And in 1998, I attended a workshop, and it was quite an interesting combination. It was partly neurolinguistic programming, and it was billed as Sufi mysticism, which it's an interesting mix of things. And one of the things that we worked with there was a tool called the Enneagram, which is one of these personality type things which you may or may not have encountered. It's out there. It's a very interesting tool. It's a slightly contentious tool. But I had a very, very powerful experience of going through and identifying my place on this. It's like a 9-pointed star. My place on this it's on this symbol. And then I went away from this course, and on the Sunday night, and I woke up at about 3 a.m, and I saw my place on this symbol. And one of the attributes is, how do you like to be communicated with? And I saw how I liked to be communicated with. And I saw my father on the symbol and how he liked to communicate. And how he liked to communicate was the worst possible option for how I liked to be communicated with. And I saw that clash, and that absolutely broke me apart. And I can remember I just howled and howled and howled for like an hour in the middle of the night. And at 7 o'clock in the morning, the phone rang. And it was my friend, the Threshold Guardian. And I picked up the phone, and in this hoarse voice said, "Hello." And she just said, "Are you okay?" And within a few days of that experience, there was a massive shedding of weight. And I went through quite a significant shift, and particularly with regard to my family, and this lostness that I'd felt all of my life started to fall away. And within a few months of that, I met my future wife as well. So that was the kind of the moment when it was like, oh, there is a way. Mm-hmm. And that was the moment when I committed to going on that journey.
Yeah. I'm glad that you brought that up. One of the reasons is it is often a spiritual experience, or something around wanting a deeper sense of our spirituality that also brings us on these journeys. And many of us try one thing or another that will. We've been talking a little bit about Neville Goddard. Rochelle had brought it up last week, and he talks about the I am, and really about identity and knowing, and that's where, for some of us, when we hear or listen to a spiritual, it could be a podcast, could be reading that we do, that something like that comes up, and that will also kick off that journey, like this kicked off the journey for you. So can you share a little bit about what your journey has been like as you have, there's so many layers, and I know we could be here for days, as all of us could tell for days, but just to share maybe some of the points where you got to one point and then you realize, okay, I'm not there yet. And, that kind of...
So I Neville Goddard, I think he's great. I think it's great, very powerful material. And one of the things he talks about is that you need to know your aim in life in order to be able to bring about the I am. And what I've come to see is that trauma obscures your aim in life. And that's why the ancestral healing work relates so well to the teachings of Neville Goddard and others like Abraham Hicks, who are using that message. You need to get to that place where what they're teaching works. You have to release enough trauma, but of course that journey is a very often some people think of spirituality as this beautifully unfolding flower. In my experience, it is absolutely the opposite. It's a descent into the bottom of the compost heap. And what happened for me, the next thing that happened after I'd been through this sort of breakthrough experience over the next few years, was that I found myself addicted to porn. And so I can remember feeling at the time, it's like, oh, I've just done all of this inner work, and I'm trying to be one of these sensitive new age guys, which was the thing back in the 90s. And next thing I'm looking at all of this porn. But of course, what I did was that I used my pattern recognition, and I understood that actually the porn was a language that was showing me my woundedness around my femininity, the way, or both the ways in which both my masculinity and my femininity were wounded inside me. And so by seeing that breakthrough, I was then able to get out of that compulsive spiral. And following on from that, I came to understand that I was carrying a lot of shame. And again, at the time, I thought that was just me. And it wasn't until I actually started doing the genealogy work and started seeing what had happened in my family and where one of my real grandmothers had disappeared, that I started to see that there were antecedents to this shame. It wasn't all mine. Some of it was repeating inside the family based on things that had happened a long time ago. And so then the journey became one, and initially I was kind of, my shame work was focused around sexuality and releasing any sense of being ashamed of myself as a sexual being. And the more I went into that, the more I saw how everybody else was completely mired in shame. And I came to see that it applied to the whole of the feminine side of our being. All of our emotional side was in shame, as well as the sexual stuff. So I spent quite some years working through on shame, and it was an area that very, very few people were looking into. It's starting to flag up bigger now. And Brené Brown was one of the first people who really picked up on it and kind of took it out to the social media generation. The work I worked with, one of the early, or the material, one of the early psychoanalysts, Wilhelm Reich, one of the very few people who understood the power of shame, and who was denigrated for that wisdom. And working through that, clearing the shame eventually led me to have breakthroughs into generational trauma. It literally, taking away the shame, lifted the lid off the patterns, and then the patterns were able to start popping out. And it was only then that I actually started to learn the language of trauma.
It is. Yeah, I love that you brought up Brene Brown. It's just remarkable that just the story. Bringing her up, it is helpful for people to know that we are all trying to bring this conversation. We're all bringing a little piece of it, and that our focus really has a lot to do with how, when we look, how much information about who we are and the patterns and all of that comes from looking back at our ancestry. But this topic of shame and all the other things that our identity, that's really not our identity, that we have this narrative we were taught as children. It gets in our way. And the more that we open up about this and the more that we talk about this, the more healing that's going to happen. And I feel like there is a huge space in the world for this discussion and this information and this research to help people heal. What are your thoughts about? Where do you feel like you are now? Do you feel that you have that sense of self now?
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing that I've come to see very clearly, and this is very recent for me, is that part of our identity is coming from knowing where we come from. And that's not just knowing it intellectually, but actually embodying it without shame, knowing what the most recent generations of our family went through. And again, as I said before, if we're relatively low sensitivity, we don't need to know, we don't care, we just rock on. And many people, they have no clue, either mentally, let alone a knowledge that there are gaps in their internal structure. They're just not sensitive enough to be aware of them. And again, so there's not a criticism. But what I came to see was that wherever there was one of my sort of recent 3 or 4 generations ancestors, wherever there was shame in their life, wherever there was some event that had impacted them, that they had to hide it, there was a blurring of their identity at that time. They had to smother part of their own identity, and then that smothered sense of identity came down to me as a place inside myself that was blurred, vague, confused. And because it was confusing, it was paralyzing. And I was like, I don't really know who I am. I don't really know where I'm trying to go, which ties in with the Neville Goddard conception of knowing your aim in life. And I'm only now starting to sense an aim in life that is beyond getting out of trauma. And so this came about through discovering that my great-grandfather's generation on my mother's side went through a double tragedy in 1925. There had already been significant problems in the family. There was an eldest son who died when he was 8 years old, and then there were another 5 children, of which the eldest was then my grandmother, and then my great-grandfather's marriage broke up or drifted apart. Don't know what happened there. And then he got involved in some tax fraud, and he ended up going to prison for 6 months. So all of these things, there's shame involved in them. There's a concealing of identity. There's a family name that's become probably been cancelled because it's undesirable. And then finally, my great-grandfather and his eldest surviving son died within a day of each other in 1925. And my great-grandfather was 54, and his eldest surviving son was 26. And it looks like this double whammy on top of all of these other disappointments and difficulties and setbacks. It literally just broke the family open, and the 2 remaining sons emigrated to New Zealand, and which set up a cycle of immigration, which was repeated in my generation when I emigrated to New Zealand in 1973, and which my son has emigrated there a few years ago to go to university, and is not showing any signs of wanting to come back. So you can see it was like just an explosion at the core of the family that just left this null space, and in that null space there is a nulled out sense of identity. And through reconstructing all of this, firstly through finding the genealogy, the mental reconstruction, and secondly actually going in and feeling into that numbness, feeling into the pain. And it's really been very, very hard. I can literally feel the pain going back up through the family of this event, and it was just too difficult for anyone to handle at that time. And there's been a really big sense of internal structure and internal wholeness that's come off doing this work. And it's really very difficult to articulate it because we don't really understand it. We're here at the Ancestral Healing Center, we're pretty much on the cutting edge of doing this work ourselves, and then trying to identify it, articulate it, work on tools to bring it forward. How do you describe it? All of these things, and that's happening in real time inside us. And yet there is this, I say, it's like just an inner sense of structure. There's an inner strength, a strength that doesn't waver. And before, I used to waver all the time. And there's just this sense of like a tree that should have grown up and wasn't able to, and now there's a trunk there that's grown up and it can bend with the wind, but it doesn't bend to the will of others. It doesn't lose itself in setbacks in the way that I used to when I was younger.
Michael, I think the journey that all of us have taken, and next week we're going to hear from Rochelle's going to tell us her her identity story. It is, we've done the work. And what's interesting is we've come to this work. I know I have, Rochelle has, and you have, with other knowledge, understanding the trauma, the ancestral part of it, all of it were pieces that we discovered were able to help us move through and to open up to understanding a deeper sense of who we are. And ultimately, it's about healing, and it's about being able to move forward. And I think that you spoke eloquently about that process. And so I want, as those who are listening, I know that wherever you are in the journey, it doesn't matter, that there is work that we can help you do here at the Ancestral Healing Center. And again, next week, Rochelle is going to share her story. I shared last week, so that's available for anybody that wants to listen. But so this is Michael. I'm grateful for the work that you do, and grateful for that we are all together as the Ancestral Healing Center. And I look forward to next week when we hear more from Rochelle.